Hello, this is International Master and author John Watson. Welcome to Beyond the Opening, which is a show that explains positional ideas and in particular emphasizes pawn structures, ones that you'll see a lot of in chess practice. I'm going through them very slowly, but I think I want to do it with some detail so you understand some of the subtleties of these pawn structures, perhaps in a way that's a little deeper than what you normally see in middle game books. So tonight I'm going to present more material on hanging pawns and isolated pawn couples, but only in the form of a couple of quick games, since you've seen a lot of those. So I'm going to rush through a couple of games, and then I'm going to get to the RAM structure and show a few games there. So without further ado, so we can get moving on this, the game in front of you, that's the initial position, and the game is between Sargassian and Halkias. And so what white does is transform the position into a hanging pawn position and attacks along the files the way we've seen to do with major pieces against the hanging pawns. Black centralizes, white takes a little bit of time and gets kicked back. So he may have thought, well, that creates a big weakness on the king side, but in fact he's also lost a little time, and those pawns may be either weak or strong. So as you remember, I think it was Botvinnik that said, we talked about this last week, that you need to attack the hanging pawns quickly before black gets really set up, and maybe white's going a little slowly to do that. Okay, so that's a move that I think deserves some attention. When you have the hanging pawns, of course, the principles are the same as with an isolated pawn or an isolated queen pawn pair, which is you have to strive for activity. The other idea here is that isolated or hanging pawn centers are more delicate in some ways than isolated pawn centers and isolated pawn pairs, because once they fall apart, once the hanging pawns fall apart, they can do so very, very quickly. And what that means is that it's hard to start a flank attack unless you can really hold the center. Well, here white's kind of been pushed back a lot, and just to make that clear, there are quite a few positions in chess where you can sort of let your center dissolve and still run a flank attack just because it takes too long for the central play to really develop, or there's other compensating factors. So flank attacks are sometimes underrated, even with fluid centers. But I think hanging pawns tend to be an exception, and here the only reason that black's able to get away with a move like g4 is because white's pieces are so passively placed, and black's really fully developed and ready to do something. I mean, he has this queen rook still to come into play, but as you'll see, since he's going to play h5, h4 to attack the king side, that rook maybe doesn't want to move yet anyway. So white goes ahead, again plays a little bit slowly, and black prepares to bring that rook to h8. Now I want to look at that last move, another slow move. What white's trying to do, by the way, is bring a knight to f4, but that's just piece play, and it's only one real good defender, so it's a little bit slow. What I want to show you is what else he could do here instead of queen f1, and that's this move. That's this move. And I want to show these to you for one last time. We've seen this break, but maybe we haven't seen it quite enough. The idea is to commit these pawns. If this pawn pushes forward, there's a huge outpost there, and that becomes a backward pawn on that c file, although that's still a very good move in many situations. And if he captures, then white still has an outpost on c4, and that c pawn becomes an isolated pawn. That's the theory. So what happens here? Of course, black still has really good activity. Now let's do a little bit of a quick variation with that. And then this move here. Now white has a pawn structure he wants. He's a pawn down, but he's going to get that back. Black defends the pawn. White chases it away. Now black could probably repeat here, but whoops. but he chooses not to. He chooses to do something else at this point, otherwise his advantage is gone, obviously. He tries to play there. Here, now notice the bishop on e7 is hanging, so he can't just take on d2. So at this point the bishop would move maybe, and white would simply come up. And this position, because of that weak pawn, is at least playable. Now black has the two bishops here, and I think probably black's still better, but at least this is a reasonable game and white's not being attacked or checkmated or anything like that. So let's go back to the game. In the game we have this move, and that allows black to, well, first of all he clamps down on the queen side and prepares rook a6 in some positions. Now he's just centralizing more, and now he starts to attack. And really white can't stop this attack with just pieces. Maybe that's the moral here. He needed e4. So this is what black wants to do with hanging pawns, is activate and attack. And he's done that. And of course the other idea here is that d4 is always a big theme. For example, right now d4 is becoming a huge threat, opening up that bishop. And remember, that's the main move in a hanging pawn position, is d4, as in an isolated pawn position, and as in an isolated pawn couple position in many cases, is just to open up the pieces with d4 if you can. Of course, there's many other plans, such as the one he's pursuing now, but that's the one white really has to watch out for. So finally he plays this move. It's just a little bit late. He's sort of trying to block off the attack, and now you can see the king is really exposed. So black makes that clever little attacking move and pins that knight. And really, if you look at it for a second, this is completely lost. The threat is either rook takes or knight takes, and just killing that piece there. So actually white resigns. He could play it out for a little bit. I mean, you could try and get a trick, for example. You could play there with the idea of winning the queen. It's probably worth at least a try, but black just moves the king. And what would happen at this point? Here, maybe he wants to take that. Here, now he's on the knight on e3, and he's still got all these queen checks coming up. So I guess rook e1 would be forced. And now notice that opens up that and attacks the knight. So what do we get here? Some sort of almost immediate win here. White might play here, attacking that bishop, just trying to get rid of one of the attackers. Black could simply defend that. Now he's got rook h1 check, which is kind of a better piece to have down there. And, well, there's really nothing left. White plays here. Black checks. And you can see this is going to be mate. There's just too many pieces around. Check, or the win of a queen in any case. Maybe he comes back again. And here's a cute little checkmate. Not surprisingly. Okay, let's move on to another game. The moral of that story is white had to break in the center earlier, and that e4 idea is pretty good, and it's even better, obviously, if he'd played it really early in the game. And we've seen that a few times, but I wanted to show it to you one more time, trying to make the advanced pawns the hanging pawns either advance or become weaker in some way. Okay, here's a position from a World Championship game. That's always nice to look at. Karpov and Korchnoi. See the ratings, they're kind of funny. Only 27.25 to 26.65, and I'm pretty sure they were the two top rated players in the world. Karpov by a landslide. And now that's, what, ordinary? Maybe top 10? Maybe not. In fact, almost certainly not, now that I think about it. But anyway, let's move on to this game here. It's an endgame. It looks completely harmless, really, especially with a move like that. Nice move covering these squares. The typical sort of French endgame. It's almost always drawn. And I want to show you, well, partly I just want to show you sort of the genius of Karpov. Well, here he makes a little feint at maybe attacking this pawn, ties down this knight for a second. So black defends the pawn and white attacks it. And black comes up to super defend it and also defend this rook, so some move like that won't pin, the pawn won't be pinned. So it looks like nothing much is happening. In fact, a lot of top commentators thought at this point that nothing was happening. Even said after the game they thought this was kind of ridiculous. That's a great move, or it looks like a great move. It has some idea of going here, but also challenging this and putting more pressure on that square. So everything seems fine, but white plays there. And what do we have now? We have an isolated pawn couple. Well, again, this doesn't seem like the most dangerous one, but first he sort of restricts these pawns, and in particular that pawn. He doesn't want c5 coming in at this point because that would equalize pretty easily. Now if black plays here, we're back to an isolated pawn and with mostly major pieces left on the board, for example here. And if he takes it, it's check, and he can come back and control that square. And major pieces, as we know in isolated pawn positions, are the ones that white in this case wants to have on the board, not minor pieces. So this would be very hard to hold if possible. So instead black says, well, I'm not too worried here. White still tries to take off those bishops, and well, you can see black's kind of tied down here. Now he'd like to play a5 or c5, especially a5, so white stops that move. And if he played c5 now, not only would that under be pressure, but that would become isolated again, so probably not worth it. Now again, maybe he's thinking about a5 or d4 or some such move, d4 I guess. And that's a nice move because it pins this, and it's like a lot of rook endings. If you can get right in front of that pawn, that's always nice. Gains a tempo against the move c5, for example. So a couple normal moves here. White enters the center, wants to play the king to d4 at some point, not yet, and gets some rooks off. Oh, I wanted to quote what I think it was Medna said about this. He says about this move a6. He gives it a question mark or question mark exclam. He says, being short of time, black commits one of the most typical time pressure mistakes, making unnecessary pawn moves. That was interesting. On a6, the pawn is at least as vulnerable as on a7 and reduces the rook to passive defense. Okay, now I'm going to actually stop here pretty much in the sense that Karpov played the move rook d1, which turned out to be inaccurate, and he played a couple other slightly inaccurate moves. Eventually the game was drawn. What he should do is simply rook e2, and I want to show you that real briefly. And Keene says, swapping black's active rook and leaving him with a miserable beast on queen knight 3. That's the old English notation for b6. And it would go something like this. Now he really, if the king gets up here and rooks get up here, we've seen how this is winning. This is typical isolated pawn couple, especially with Karpov, so he almost has to try something. Now he could try that move, but it doesn't really help because then these pawns are both extremely weak and the rook has nice activity. So the only move that I put in here as a kind of possibility is this, and then the problem is he can't move the d pawn. These pawns are still weak. And with those kind of weaknesses, it turns out that black should lose with two serious weaknesses. Okay, let's move on to the next game. Okay, here's Petrosian Smyslov. As I say, you can't go wrong with world champions. It's not a world championship match. They never played that, but certainly they're great players. And I'm sorry I started with this move c takes d5, which is kind of funny in the middle of an exchange. But what we're getting to is isolated pawn position. You've seen plenty of these, isolated queen pawn, and we're going to get to other isolated pawns, and maybe after a couple more lectures, maybe only after one more. At any rate, it's your typical position, and the one difference is that this guy's sort of hanging, but white says I don't care about that, and he had anticipated this position. Of course, this could be a threat, and he doesn't really mind this because he's got so much extra space, and that doesn't mean he's happy with it. The threat is queen e4, threatening checkmate and then knight, but he's got a lot of chances. Bring the rooks to the center. Only one minor piece has been exchanged. And instead, black plays very interestingly. He says, I don't care about that bishop. I'm going to take that and then just develop, attack that bishop, force it to retreat. Now remember, with hanging pawns, you really want that bishop over here. So if white plays c4 soon, he doesn't have an ideal position. Black makes it pretty hard to play c4 anyway. White takes the file, black takes the file, and we can see the usual isolated pawn pair issues. Okay, now white comes up, and this makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of pieces kind of towards that king side, an awful lot of them. So he's going to attack on the king side, and one way he's trying to do that is to play the move rook g4, threatening bishop h6, and then maybe even if the king moves, play rook h4 and get all kinds of attacks going there. So black has to move quickly here, and how's he going to do that? This is fairly solid, it looks like, in the center, and black, White's really starting to do what we've seen before, just sort of roll over black's position. So here's how he handles it. That move attacks this bishop. Doesn't look that useful, except that now he's able to play this nice little exchange sacrifice. You might think at first that that's a rook sacrifice, but he gets the piece back with the move rook c8, and now he's going to have a pawn for the exchange, and his pieces are going to be just wonderful. Look at this. Well, we'll make one more move here. Look what's happening here. This bishop along this diagonal. These knights are very intrusively placed into white's position. Maybe taking here is possible. The d5 square is ideal, and black's rook is on an open file, whereas white's not. That's more than enough compensation, especially since he has a pawn as well. So we can see that Petrosian is in some trouble here, even with his incredible defensive prowess. So let's just see what happens here. Attacks the rook. And now already we have a double attack. He's attacking the rook here, and he's attacking this square, which is a fork. So already at this point he's giving back the material. That's about the end of the game, really. We'll see a Petrosian counterattack sort of desperately here, correctly, but now his king's exposed and he's a pawn down. So white tries to enter into the fray. Now the d-pawn's hanging. He's going to trade it for the e-pawn. And really that's enough. Look at the rook against the isolated pawn. 3 isolated pawns and a pawn ahead. And we're talking about Smyslov, who wasn't all that bad at the endgame. So, okay, on to the next game. Okay, finally we're done with review and repetition, and we're on to a new structure. This is called the RAM structure. And I've mentioned it before, we've even had a game. We had a really pretty game, if you want to go back. It was between Karpov and Ullman, where Karpov triumphed against the RAM skeleton in one of his most famous games. Just an absolutely brilliant endgame, or late middle game. Anyway, why are we talking about this with the isolated pawn? Well, because let's say black had the isolated pawn, white had a pawn here. Oftentimes, if black has a knight here, or a bishop, dark square bishop, he would like to exchange on that square, and when white takes back, we get the RAM skeleton here. And oftentimes that's good because he's liquidated the attack along the file against his isolated pawn. So this is theoretically in pawn structure terms about equal. Well, the only issue is who's benefited by that, and that depends on the minor pieces, and it depends on who controls the files more than anything else. Of course the queens are important too, but mostly what's important here is the weakness of one of the two pawns. Now often neither one is weak, and maybe you get a quick draw or at least an even game, but very often the side that's liquidating that isolated pawn is doing so for a reason, or the other side is willing to do so, or even tries to force him to do that for a reason, and that reason is usually because the remaining pawn is weak, the remaining d pawn is weak. This comes up in a bunch of openings, comes up in all kinds of middle games. One of the openings maybe I should mention is the symmetrical English, where this often happens. And for example, if white's knight is here and black's knight is here, white will often get an advantage. The bishops are usually here, and there's a knight here, maybe a queen can come here. That d pawn is actually weak and can be taken, can be piled up upon. And the question is whether black has enough counterplay to even that out. But the point is that in a lot of positions these d pawns will be quite safe because they aren't on open files, but there are positions, including some of the ones we'll see, where that's really not true, or where those pawns are fine but they create other problems. So let's just go on and see an example of that. Okay, here's a very, very famous game. You may have seen this between Botvinnik and Elyekin from Avro, the famous Avro tournament in Amsterdam in 1938. More world champions. We're really into world champions today. Okay, let's just whip through the opening. You may have seen this before. It's a standard semi-Tarrasch position. Guess what? Isolated pawn. Knight on d5 as opposed to f6, bishop on c4 as opposed to d3. Those are the usual options for those pieces. They can be in any combination of those. And black plays this move. This is actually a positional mistake. We've seen the idea, this is actually a positional mistake. We've seen the idea of knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, the isolated pawn couple quite a few times, and of course that can favor either side. That can favor white because he's managed to strengthen his center and he has time to attack the king, or it can favor black in ways that we just saw in terms of, for example, playing knight here and bishop here and rook here and getting a queenside attack, queenside bind going on. So we've seen this plenty of time. So what white does here is kind of interesting. The reason it's a mistake is because white can play this move and form the ram skeleton. Before we get to that, let me show you another ram skeleton that we've already seen. I'm going to get there sort of artificially, but I want to show you another trick that leads to the ram skeleton. Here's one that this exact position, you have to watch out for that to get isolated or to get into a ram position. And the other one we looked at, I'm going to kind of artificially, let me see, get to this position. Let's say he played this and white came back. But now b6 would lead to almost the exact same position. I guess b5 is more natural. But the point is, it's premature to play this kind of position because that move is so strong. Why is that move so strong? We saw this already. We saw this last lecture. It's strong because now the knight's hanging, and now the knight's hanging again. It's pinned, and now this move, and there's a threat of knight takes knight, followed by, after queen f4, followed by knight e7 check, and a bunch of other threats too. So black's really in terrible shape. I mean, it turns out rook a e8 is pretty much his only move, and then white wins at least a pawn. So that's a terrible position. But if he takes on the ram position here with this move, then we have simply the move we saw last week, or a variant of it, which is simply winning a pawn, check, king goes somewhere, and then back, and we've won a pawn with still a very good game on top of that. So that's another way of getting that ram position that's just a mistake. Now that's a mistake because he loses material. In this game, what happens is that mistake, and white simply gets great pressure. So it's a little bit different. Black plays this move. What's going on here is black has some weakened queenside squares and is able to attack. Black has some weakened queenside squares, and white is able to attack along those lines and along the c file. Now I should say something that doesn't seem to be in any book. This is a famous game, as I say, which is that I think black should just play here, even though it's obvious why he didn't play there. It runs right into a center pawn. That's almost the definition of a bad bishop. But in fact, this is kind of okay because he's able to sort of consolidate. He can always move that bishop back later. And just to show you that, this move, I think actually a3 might be a little better, even though this is completely natural. Here and here. Notice that white couldn't take that and take this because the queen would be trapped. So this is like the game. White seems to have a much better game, but it's really not so easy because black just plays here. Now if bishop takes, rook a8, so that's not possible. And black's sort of getting out. He can play moves like b5, maybe queen b6, rook d8, I don't know. Bishop f6 is a very handy move. So white can either play bishop d3, but after that move, this is very easy. Just bishop f6. That position is pretty easy to defend. No big problems. This can get into play later. Maybe white slightly better, but very slightly. And also, this is very interesting. Why not give that up and keep black with a bad bishop? The knight's obviously a pretty good piece here. But even this one's nothing special. White can, for example, try to double here and keep up some pressure. But I think black should have played this way. White's better, but not much better, because what happened was that he played this move, more natural in a way, but now white attacks that, and there's no easy way to defend that without getting in trouble. He plays that move. Because this move, it turns out that the rook isn't going to be able to move again. Black is totally tied down here. It's very difficult to move here. So black tries to get some pieces off, and white makes that move anyway. You can see that black's really tied down here. Just look at the minor pieces. This knight's better than that knight. This bishop's somewhat better than that, and white is already on the file. That's important. White's already on an open file, and he has another one handy. So these are temporary advantages, but they're important. And black's just weakened his queen side a little. Pretty much had to. Black opposes those bishops. It's not so clear that he should do that. But already there's big problems. I mean, for example, a second ago, just to show you this, white was already threatening rook d5, e5, winning the d5 pawn. So that d5 pawn is much more vulnerable than this d4 pawn. So black kicks him out at the cost of making some weaknesses, covers the e5 square, but now white temporarily has both files. As I say, these are temporary advantages, but they're serious. Black covers some key squares and thinks about playing rook c7, but white stops him and consolidates his advantage. And that's typical. White has better control of open files and the superior minor piece. You can see that the black knight on b8 is a problem, and it's hard to get out. So this is a typical RAM structure situation where one side has the advantage. I should emphasize a lot of times the RAM structure is just equal, but in isolated queen pawn positions it's often not equal because one side or the other is eager to get to it and have these kinds of advantages. Okay, these are just moves. By the way, the f6 was not only prepare that, but to stop knight e5. Okay, now white goes back. He's not getting anywhere by just repeating, but there's sort of a little bit of a zugzwang here, because if black now plays knight d7, rook c7 is going to come with tempo. If black plays king f7, rook c7 is going to come with tempo, and the rook is going to be able to stay on the 7th rank. So that's sort of the idea. So black plays, just tries to get rid of that knight, and the knight retreats voluntarily, and you'll see why that is in a second. Because right now this square doesn't look like it's that special, does it? Maybe this square to attack from that square and get to that big control over f5 and pressure on d5. But let's see how it happens. This is the key move, and he doesn't have to play it immediately, but it provokes weaknesses. You could have played it one move later. It's worth seeing the technique here, partly because it's instructive anyway how to win this, but partly because it shows how in the RAM structure the weaker side's d-pawn can often get in trouble. Okay, that's a concession, but the problem is if he plays something like this, can either take that pawn or go here. That's similar to the game, and he's threatening to take and get big squares. So that's one way to get this position. Now f4 is vulnerable because of this. And there's still that idea of knight c2 to knight c2 to e3, which is also very strong. So black's advanced and weakened his pawns, though he didn't really have that much of a choice about it. If he takes, instead of just if he takes here, instead of just running over to take that, for example, like this, white has an even better move, which is to play this move to get the knight to that incredible square f4. And just a quick example would be here, just to protect some of those kingside pawns, like the h pawn here. And now maybe just bring the rook over, even though it gives up that file, because he's threatening this followed by that, and it's really impossible to stop. And then that's weak again, so it's almost like 3 pawns are hanging. So a real quick sample of that would be here, here. Yeah, rook comes down to counterattack. Here, another check. Take a pawn, but after check, here, here. You can see that things are really going wrong here. The knight's still back here. It's going to get really in trouble soon if it's not careful. So you can just take it from here. I mean, maybe a quick line would be something like this. King goes somewhere, and then back again, attacking these two. And white's going to have a million passed pawns, and he's a pawn ahead, and the knight's more active, and the king's more active. I think that's enough of that. Okay, so that shows you why this is really such a good move. It threatens to weaken these squares, but the pawn really can't advance. So black just develops, white takes the 7th rank, white threatens g5, comes back again. Now he's threatening knight d3, and then f4 or b4. So black at least tries to stop the knight f4 move, which is so dangerous. White just prevents f3. He's got all the time in the world now. Black can't really move here. So black tries to centralize. That h-pawn could be taken probably. Well, white's just choosing one way to try to win this position. You'll see what that is in a second. Okay, takes over that big square now. This is basically just technique. I think I'll just show this. Really at some point white could have played this move. Maybe even now. Maybe a little earlier. This move b4 probably would have won because it would have threatened to isolate that or just win this. That was a bit earlier. This is fine. I don't know. There's no problem with this at all. Look at that knight on e5. Dominant piece. Threatening knight e7 check. Plays it anyway and wins the d-pawn. And I'll just whip through this. You know, great players, it's always good to see technique. Well, it's a lot of pawns. And the idea is king e4. And the pawns can advance, and this is hopeless, and so black resigned. He said that this was the best game in Avro that someone played against him out of the 14 games. So I was going to get in one more RAM structure game, but didn't really have time, so next week we'll start with that. I'll look at a couple of those. There's some other very interesting structures to look at with isolated queen pawns, and so thank you very much. This has been Beyond the Opening with John Watson, and I'll see you next week.